So this is Steve, and I'm here with Thad Gerardot. He is a Democrat, and he's a first-time office seeker, and he's running for the House District, 81st District here in Indiana. Thad, we appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me and reaching out about doing the interview. And yes, to tell a little bit about me, I'm born and raised here in Fort Wayne. I went to St. Vincent's for elementary school, Bishop Dwenger for high school, and I graduated from IPFW. And I live downtown and I work at Lincoln Financial Group. And I guess a lot of people ask me, you're a first-time candidate, why are you running? And a lot of that is I'm really concerned about the future of Fort Wayne. I see the younger generation, a lot of them leaving. I'm concerned. I think there's a big disconnect right now in the legislature between what a lot of politicians often follow and versus who they actually represent. And that's a big reason why I'm running. I want to represent Fort Wayne. I love this part of the state. I love the city. I lived here my whole life, and I'd be proud to be down at the State House next year.
So you talked a little bit about, kind of stole my next question there about why you're running. Anything else that you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, well, I guess a little bit more about me too, and with my family. My great uncle was the bishop of the diocese here in Fort Wayne back in the 60s and 70s, Bishop Leo Persley. My grandpa was a farmer in eastern Allen County, and my father was an architect and a project manager. He was the architect that did the old Wizard Stadium, and he actually did this library and the Grand Wayne Center expansions back in 2006.
Let's talk a little bit about what do you think are the top 3 issues that are going to be facing Indiana if you're elected in the next term?
Well, and a lot of that has to do with the feedback I've been getting on what we need to focus on. And one of my biggest concerns is that the legislature often focuses on issues that their constituents don't really either care about or would rather have them focus on other issues. And so with my campaign, we've kind of phrased it where we go out into neighborhoods, we make phone calls, and we've made a lot of them, and we ask people what issues are most important to you and your family here in Indiana. And the top 3 things that I hear all the time are, I have a job now, but it pays less than I used to make. I'm really worried about my kids' school. I've seen major cuts to it. And I'm worried about my neighborhood, the safety and quality of life in my neighborhood. And so those are the 3 things that I think I would like to focus on, and I think that's what our legislature should focus on.
Let's talk a little bit about the legislative actions that you feel sometimes they're doing without thinking through the consequences. Right. Can you give me a specific?
Well, for example, I think the biggest problem is sometimes extremes on both sides a lot of time control the conversation in the state. And a lot of times, most Hoosiers, I feel, are right in the middle, and they want some more moderation. And I guess if you had to claim, there's a couple examples from the last session. One would be the guns bill that they tried to pass to allow guns to come onto school property. But I'm a big proponent of the Second Amendment, but at the same time, I feel like that wasn't an issue most Hoosiers were wanting to focus on or care about. It was a divisive issue, and it wasn't something that most parents were concerned with. Another one would be obviously HR 3. Consume the entire legislative session. I sat in those committee hearings that took over 6 hours long, and we could have been talking about the new standards for education that they just implemented. We could have spent that time talking about those. Instead, we talked about duplicating a state law and spent almost half a session only obsessing about that one issue.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that sometimes, like in the example of property tax caps that were enacted a couple of years ago and written into the Constitution, do you think that, 2-part question, do you think that it's okay to write things into the Constitution at that point that quickly?
No, and I think the problem is Indiana has a constitution that's one of the hardest to amend in the entire country. You have to pass it in 2 separate legislative bodies that are successive, and then it has to go to a referendum, it was designed that way for a reason because if you want to put something in the Constitution, we have a lot of value to our Constitution. It should meet the rigorous test to actually get into it. But the problem is now legislators, at least towards in the last 25 years or so in Indiana, we're taking policy and placing policy into our Constitution, which really I believe that the Constitution was formed to show, how does government work? How does it run on a daily basis? And that's really what I think the Constitution was, our core beliefs and how we should run our government, not taking random policy and putting it in there. And the problem is when you do that, you also limit yourself to actually fix it. And we should have just passed a law, because then if there's a problem, we can tweak that really quickly and fix it without having to go another 4 years just to make a change.
You mentioned neighborhoods. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Well, at the state level, there's not a lot of direct impact we can have on neighborhoods. That has a lot to do with local government. But what we can do is making sure that we're working with local leaders. I know, for example, Mayor Henry down here in Fort Wayne has to drive to the State House all the time to lobby against legislation because it would hurt Fort Wayne. I mean, for example, like the tax cap on property in the Constitution, that's really hurt Fort Wayne's ability, to balance our own budget. And I think that puts a strain on the city, especially to provide services that do impact your neighborhood. Services that actually keep your neighborhood clean, services like police officers, firefighters, making sure we have those properly funded so that you do have a safe neighborhood. In that impact, you can't directly impact the neighborhood, but you can by working with the local governments.
Sure. So talk with me a little bit about education and what you feel are the issues there.
Well, it depends on the level. There's really all the way from pre-K up to secondary or post-secondary education right now. There's a lot of changes that need to happen. I think the most pressing concern for us in Northeast Indiana right now is that we work to improve IPFW. It's important for economic development in the area that we actually work and have IPFW be our biggest asset, be the driver at creating the workforce of the future. And right now they're predicting by 2025, 60% of our jobs here in Northeast Indiana are going to require some sort of post-secondary degree, but yet people from this area, only about anywhere from 34 to 36% actually have one. So that tells me, in the next decade, we need to actually improve that, or there could be jobs that leave because we don't have the workforce, or it'll be really hard to actually attract businesses if they bring over jobs that pay really well, but we already don't have the workforce and they don't feel that they can recruit here. So I think it's really important. I mean, it's our largest university. It's hurting right now, almost $1 million cut last year from its budget. And a lot of that has to do with the formula to fund IPFW. It's a flat formula that applies to all public universities right now. And obviously IPFW has a different demographic student makeup than IU or Purdue. And so we need to make sure that IPFW has its own funding formula so we're not hindering its ability to actually create the workforce of the future.
Should there be more oversight with universities and spending?
Mm-hmm. Right, well, I think the funding formulas isn't so much oversight, just making sure that the state's funding it properly, making sure that we're doing what is necessary for them to actually offer different degrees that our local businesses want. And a lot of it in the recent survey done with IPFW showed that there needs to be more cooperation between our local businesses and IPFW. For example, over 12% of our local economy is in the insurance and finance industry here in Fort Wayne, but yet we don't offer any sort of insurance and risk management degree, which would greatly help those businesses in this area, but yet when local businesses have reached out, there hasn't been much happening. So we could actually start recruiting people and training them from our own part of the state, rather than these companies having to go outside the state to recruit. And I think that would be huge for IPFW and the area. Then next I would say pre-K education too. We have a pilot program. I mean, we're one of only about a handful of states that have no public pre-K system. It's shown to be successful in every other state. So making sure we're looking at the results of the pilot program and implementing it if it's successful as soon as possible. I think giving students the chance to learn and be on an equal playing field earlier will help them to read by 3rd grade. So they're more likely to graduate from high school. They're more likely to go on and be successful in life if we start them off at 3, 4, or 5 years old.
There seems to be sort of I don't know if disconnect is the proper term, but there seems to be some friction there between the governor and the superintendent of education. Right. Is that something that needs to be looked at? Well,
I think a lot of Hoosiers have a problem with what's going on. There's been a lot of kind of political wrangling and back and forth, and a lot of people, want our education system to start focusing on children. And it's really hard when the majority of people in Allen County voted for Glenda Ritz. She was an elected official, and to have a governor start appointing people who were not elected, going around her and having more authority, that's against the will of the people. There's a reason she's elected and why several Republicans voted for Glenda Ritz. And I think she should be able to implement what she ran on. And I'm a supporter of having elected officials making the decisions.
Sure. And going back to IPFW in particular, up until this year, they had done a lot of public events. The River Fest that they would have in June and some other things like that. A lot of spending that would go into these projects. Is that something that, that kind of spending and building a new building every year, and
Right.
Is that something that needs to be looked at?
Well, I think you definitely need to look at that as well. But at the same time, they're also trying to attract students to the school. Even though you can't just have a school that is just very plain and doesn't look attractive to new students, or they won't go there. So you have to be able to make sure you're looking at what are new students looking for in a school. Why are they going to come to Northeast Indiana over, say, IUPY or Indiana Tech or Indiana University? And so we have to make sure that the school still is attractive to those students.
Economic development is another one of those issues. What do you think, first of all, should government's role be in economic development?
Right. I think when it comes to economic development, really we need to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to start a business. And right now the millennial generation wants to start a business more than any other generation previous. And not only that, they're more confident and more positive and more likely to hire than small business owners of other generations. So we need to foster that. There's a lot of people that want to start businesses, so we need to make sure it's easy as possible for them to do that. And I think that'll be a big driver going into the next 10, 20 years in our economy.
When you talk about economic development, there's tax abatements, tax deferrals that can be given, incentives. How do you feel about those? And that's more, a lot of times, a county issue. You may not deal with it in the legislature, but I think it's still an interesting
Right, and
subject.
it's important to be responsible with it, and I think there has been some debate, if you give an abatement to a company and they come in and then end up cutting jobs, is it going to be worth the county's while? And I think that's something that needs to be made at the local level rather than at the state. Local governments do know what's best for their community, and here in Indiana we have so many different parts of the state that are really different from each other. I mean, you have up near Chicago is very different than rural Seymour or down in southern Indiana. So I do support making sure that local governments are making those decisions on what's best for the community.
Let's talk a little bit about public transportation and throw in there mass transit, some things like that as well. It's not maybe an issue that comes up with the legislature a lot, but what are your feelings on mass transit?
Right, and I've talked to some people on this issue too. The demand for mass transit is going up, and unfortunately it's been pretty much the same budget every year for mass transit. I know here in Fort Wayne, one of the biggest complaints is, I would use the bus more if it ran all the time. If it ran on the weekends longer, or if it ran later at night. And a lot of younger people, there's a push to move back to the center. A lot of millennial generation wants to live in an urban core. They want to be able to bike places, want to be able to take public transportation. So I think we're going to see that demand increase over time. And especially Indiana is becoming much more urbanized. Our population is shifting more towards cities rather than in rural counties. And so we have to be able to have the transportation of the future and making sure that our state government is also adjusting with that demand. I think it'll be better for our community. I mean, Fort Wayne used to be ranked one of the worst in the country for single commuter drivers to work. And I think that's an issue we should start focusing on.
In particular, in this area, it's not so much high-speed rail as it is just passenger rail service back in this area. Right. The corridor from Chicago to Columbus, is that something you would support?
Oh, absolutely. I think it can be one of the best economic drivers to this area. And right now I know it's in the environmental study stage that we're paying for. But I think as a state level, we need to make sure that we're being aggressive about going after the federal dollars when they're available. Because it's really going to be the federal government that steps in and funds a lot of this as well. And I think we are, in a prime location between Chicago and Columbus. And I think the mayors in the cities along the way have done a great job of working together, making sure we're all making this a reality over the next, 10, 15 years. If it does happen, it's going to be great for Fort Wayne, being able to go to Chicago back and forth. We could probably easily attract some businesses from the Chicago area to come to Fort Wayne, where the cost of living is much better, and you could easily commute, an hour and a half or so.
Election reform.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on election reform?
Here in Indiana, we're one of only 3 states that's polls close at 6 o'clock. And I think that's a big concern for voter participation because we have one of the lowest voter turnouts in the country. And for most people, especially working class families, if you wake up in the morning and you have a bunch of kids, your job is to get them to school on time and get them going and then go to work. And if you get off 5:30, you have to rush just to get there on voting day. And I think that's a big concern. I think it should at least be increased by an hour to 7, make it easier for voters to actually get to the polls. I also think that students should be able to use their college ID if they're at a public university as their ID to vote. It's a government issued ID, I think it should count. And also redistricting. I think we need to have a bipartisan commission for actual redistricting that draws the lines and is signed off by Indiana Supreme Court as well. And I think that would be fair. And the reason I think that is because often some of these districts are so safe that we're really disenfranchising voters because we're only giving them one option. And I think if we drew them to be more fair, we'd have better quality candidates, we'd have more options, and then more people would actually turn out and participate in elections because it wasn't just I'm voting for one person and there's no point. So,
Talk with me a little bit about healthcare, your thoughts on healthcare in Indiana.
right, and at the state level, obviously we don't have a lot to do with a lot of the federal laws, but one of my biggest concerns was that we didn't expand Medicaid. And I've talked to a lot of people in the neighborhoods who were impacted by that, who made just a little bit over the threshold and unfortunately are going to be left behind this year. And we left a lot of people behind by not making that decision. I think it was a political decision rather than what was best for Hoosiers. Now I know we're going to be expanding the Healthy Indiana plan, and my biggest concern with that is making sure we're implementing it correctly and it's going to be effective. It's going to be about 300,000 more people that are actually enrolled in this program, and with some of the massive budget cuts we've done to Department of Child Services and some of these groups that are actually going to be helping with it, that's a huge concern if we're going to take on 300,000 new people, and we've seen some of the budget cuts to some of these departments.
Let's switch gears a little bit, talk about the criminal justice system. Is sentencing reform something that needs to be looked at in the next few years?
Well, I know we just did several reforms just this past legislative session. So for me, I think some of them are really good. I think if you aren't committing violent crime, you shouldn't be in jail for a long time. There should be more programs to get you back into society. So I definitely supported some of that. I know there's going to be some extra burden on county governments because a lot of the people that usually went to state jail will now be going to the county prisons for longer. And I guess that would be a concern of mine because I think it's hard for a lot of local governments right now. They're strapped, they're tight with their budgets, and for the state to be shifting more money onto them, I think it's going to hurt them. So I think looking at that would be an issue on what the state can do to help relieve some of these local governments.
Let's say that county legislator, county elected officials came to Indianapolis and said, "Hey, and this is just a what if, we want the city of Fort Wayne to share in the criminal justice system costs." What would your response as a legislator be?
Well, I mean, we'd have to look at it. I mean, that's going to be a local issue as well, where the state could get involved because it's a conflict between the city and county. But it's a county jail, so it's hard to just say the city's forced to do it. I know the city does use it quite a bit, but the city's within the county as well. I think that's something where I would take both sides of the issue and actually sit both leaders down, talk about it, the pros and cons of what that would do. That's also going to increase, the amount of money the city's going to have to pay for it now, and how we're going to come up with those funds as well. So I think that would be something we'd have to really sit down and talk about before we made any decisions.
That again is one of those areas that I don't remember specifically if it's written into the Constitution as far as that's a county prerogative or a county area that they have to, but it would require state legislative changes to create that. So
right, and that's something we could even do a referendum type on, similar to what they're doing this year with the single county executives, seeing how people feel about it, our voters as well.
That single county executive, how do you feel about that?
Well, I sit down with a lot of people on it, and with that issue, the one thing I do like about it, and I do support it for, is that I like the idea of 9 districts. And the reason right now is I don't believe that the county council is a true representative of everyone in the community. I think there's definitely some different parts of even Fort Wayne and smaller towns that could use some better representation on the council. And that's the big reason why I support it. I think it'll be a little bit more representative of the community rather than some of the district seats now, which are just not drawn yet necessarily to what our county actually represents.
I know the sticking point that I've heard a lot about is people feel there would be a loss of representation because you're going from what you currently have, which is 4 single, 3 at large, and you're going down to 9 single with no at large, and you're eliminating 3 commissioners and going with 1 single executive. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it depends on sometimes who you're talking to. I think it's a little bit stronger representation since you are having 9 seats. You get to actually have a bigger impact on that one representative rather than a lot of these were at large. And the county's a big county. It's really hard to say that an at-large person with 350,000 people representing really is a better representation of you when they represent such a large county. Whereas your one representative with less people, you get to meet that person more. You get a little bit more face time, you have a little more impact, they're going to be listening to you more, and I think that's why it's a little bit better representation.
Talk to me a little bit about, you were very involved in HR 3 and helping to work on that issue, which is the same-sex marriage here in Indiana. Tell me a little bit about that fight, maybe what you learned.
Right. Well, I think that the biggest thing about that fight is, one, it has been going on for a decade. And a lot of that has to go back to our Constitution is very hard to amend. It's a very rigorous process. It takes at least 4 years to do. And throughout the course of a decade, there's always been a legislature says, no, this is a bad idea. And that's happened several times. And once again, they were bringing it up. And it was an issue that is divisive. It's exclusive. And my biggest thing for Indiana going forward is we need an inclusive state that values diversity in its population. And really most of the businesses in this state feel the same exact way. When it came to that fight, our largest employers, our largest universities, the media, newspapers, there was everyone was saying this is wrong. This is divisive. Why are we focusing on an issue that when we should be talking about schools and jobs and our neighborhoods and all these other important things? Instead, we're talking about duplicating a state law, and we're telling our state that these people aren't welcome here. And that was my biggest problem. Fort Wayne's a city that I'm very proud to live in. I think I want to attract people here. I want talent to come in, and this was shutting the door on a lot of people. And I think the biggest problem with this as well is that employers are saying, some of our best ideas come from when we have a diverse workforce. The most creative businesses that have a diverse workforce are 30% more efficient, they're 30% competing against their other companies that are similar to them. So they want that. Some of our biggest employers like Lincoln and Sweetwater and Beer Bradley all understand that as well. They want diverse workforces because it's more competitive and it's better for their communities and their business.
We've covered a lot. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think that covers all the bases, really, and most of the things I talk about. So.
Okay. Well, Thad, we appreciate your time tonight, and we wish you well in November.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Sure.